Well, as everyone has said, it's an honor to be here. I think for everyone in the room, we all feel that. Most of us were here, many of us were here for RunFest 1.0. RunFest 2.0 is an equally wonderful occasion, and I'm happy to be here as part of that as well. It provokes thoughts, both personal and professional, I think, again, for pretty much everybody who's known Ron throughout the years. And listening to the event today has done the same for me. So I'm the moderator, but I'm going to steal a couple minutes here at the start, shamelessly, to just add in a couple of things of my own. One is Don Raleigh's comments about writing to Ron echoed something for me. I was an undergraduate student writing a thesis on, of all things, Ukraine, and I wrote to Ron when my teacher said, there's only one person out there who really understands Russia and the non-Russian nationalities. You should write to him and see what he has to say about this. I wrote to him, and believe it or not, he wrote back. It was astonishing. I was an undergrad at a little college in New England, and he took the time to write back. Ron, at that point, established an example of being a humane presence. He became a sort of unspoken mentor to me when he had no stakes in my career. I went to him with all sorts of questions in the years that followed. And then later he became my colleague. And that's one of the greatest honors of being at Michigan for me. So thank you to Ron on a personal level. He also was a professional inspiration to me. He made it clear that it's possible to choose to invest career energy and investment in an impossibly obscure place and still survive. So I opted for Uzbekistan, which, if anything, was even more obscure and even less well-funded than that which he had chosen, but he showed that it could be done. And in fact, when I got to my own prelims, it kind of was the Ron Suny show. I was sort of asked to talk about the place of nationality in the Soviet past, which was a set of thematics that I took as central. And of course, the Baku Commune still sat almost alone on my prelims list at that point. There were a few others out there. Interestingly, as I was reflecting on this this morning, they mostly weren't in history. There were a couple of others that haven't been mentioned yet. Edward Allworth wrote a book about Uzbek literary politics, published in 1964. I have to say the Central Asians are out ahead here, in this instance. Teresa Rakowska-Harmstone, who was a Canadian-Polish political scientist, wrote a book about Tajikistan, of all things, in 1970. And then there was Gregory Messel, who wrote a book that was especially important for me about gender politics in Uzbekistan. That was published in 1974, also a political scientist. It's really interesting to think about how the disciplinary divides were inflected at that moment because of some of our discussions about disciplinarity here. So all of that meant when my prelims were there, it still was almost alone in the 1990s, even though I too came into grad school during those Yugoslav civil wars. I remember those events like we heard about from Golfo and Krista. And the tools for understanding nationality were tools that Ron had already developed, as we heard about in the last panel. The striking thing for me is that Ron didn't stop there, though. As we've also been saying, Ron was voracious. He kept looking for ways to understand and explain more fully the human complexities that he saw around him, such as his move into emotions, and such as his move into empires. That's what we bring to this panel, where at that point, my prelims list had almost nothing about the Soviet Union from an imperial colonial vein. That was something that appeared later, something that I tried to take part in. It brought onto the table questions of systems and identities and centers and peripheries and the reflection on what all of this might mean for thinking about this part of the world. And of course, Ron took part. How could he not? It was something to be added to that toolkit, something to better understand the part of the world he most understood too, and to take that translation outward. And that's what brings us to this panel. And that's where we have Val Kivelson, who we heard earlier today, the Thomas Tentler Professor of History, who has written with Ron on this theme. And then Jeff Veidlinger, the Joseph Brodsky Professor of Judaic Studies and History, to continue that conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to them now. Val.
We've decided to use the podium, so that's what I'm doing. Thank you, Doug. I want to hold up this book, which some say is the best book on empire available, which it was my great pleasure to write together with Ron, and it gave us opportunity to work even more closely and more extensively together than our long history of teaching and arguing and dining had done. So empire is a theme very close to both of our hearts. My comments today will span the two categories we've set out for the agendas for the speakers. We set it up, I don't know if that's clear, but the first speaker is supposed to talk about Ron's contributions and impact on the field, and the second speaker is supposed to talk about Ron's impact on their own writing. And sorry, Jeff, but I'm straying into your turf. I'm sure you're straying into mine, so it's probably okay. But since we did co-author, it's very hard for me to separate Ron's work from his influence on me. Working with him, I've learned from him tremendously and internalized many of his ideas. So let me turn to Ron on empire. My assigned text for today was not the book, but Ron's article, The Empire Strikes Out, I think 2001. I realized that the text I was working from was from the Red Flag volume, but the original date was 2001. And it really anticipated so much of what is in the book. In fact, it was a little humbling reading it. So in tackling the topic of empire, Ron's approach was very much Ron's approach, which is systematic, clear, and problem-driven. So as far as I can tell, what he does when he approaches a new topic is he reads everything that's out there, including the theoretical literature, to understand the range of models that are out there. He sets out a clear and specific definition of terms. And this is something I really appreciate in his work, that when he talks about something, you actually know what the thing is that he's talking about. And then he asks a question, a productive, fruitful, important question, and proceeds to answer it. So that's what he did as we thought about the Empire book. His interest in theoretical models, I think, was reinforced by his time of voluntary exile in Chicago. I thought I was going to introduce that term, but somebody else got to it first. But it's also his own natural tendency, I think, to look at the theories out there and see what's usable and what's not. With Empire, he did the same thing, and in his usual wide-ranging way. So he looks, although he's a modernist, he looks at theories of empire tracing back to Rome and all the way through medieval and early modern. He's very interested in Anthony Pagden's work, for instance. And he also brings in the models of political scientists like Michael Doyle to look at ways that empire can be abstracted from its specific cases and refined. From these theoretical positions, he then distills a four-part definition of empire. So, actually it has more parts, but I'm distilling the distillation into four. First, a claim to absolute sovereignty, answerable to no one, a non-subordinate power is an emperor. Second, an empire should be immense. It should involve extended territories. Third, it should encompass diverse territories under a single authority. And fourth, dominion or control between units should be set apart in a hierarchical, inequitable relationship. empires are composite states in which a metropole dominates a periphery to the disadvantage of a periphery. So that's the ideal type. There are cases that complicate those definitions, like Belgium, one of Ron's favorites, a little tiny mini empire where category 3 doesn't really work. It's not a vast, extensive territory, but it has lots of imperial characteristics. Given his own interest in nations and nation making that we've just heard about, empire seemed the next step to Ron, I think, as the ideal counterpart to nation. This is really his point of entry into the study of empire. So when considered, again, as ideal types, the opposition between nation and empire make the characteristics of each one clearer. Nation is homogeneous in human and geographic terms. It's horizontal, it's egalitarian, and sovereignty by right is vested in something known as the people. Empire is everything that nation is not. It's vertical, it's differentiated in human and geographic terms, it's deliberately unequal or even explicitly anti-egalitarian, and sovereignty is vested in a single ruler or regime. Now, Ron will have none of the idea that nation exists in pre-modern times, a point of extended debate between the two of us. But he is open to the idea that various developmental prefigurations or glimmers of what is to come will show up before the modern, various kinds of proto-nationalisms, if you will. In Russian history, as elsewhere, the nation becomes a hot issue in the early 19th century, in what Ron calls the moment of the nation. Throughout the 19th century in Russia, the tensions between the two ideal types became explicit when the imperial regime found itself challenged by the rising tides of nationalism, and the world around Russia embraced popular nationalism. This is something Olga has worked on extensively as well. Forced to address this ideological threat, the Russian regime adopts a two-tined strategy, which involve, first, crush even the most loyal expressions of an ethnic Russian nationalism, and two, introduce official nationalism, a tepid, state-focused kind of imperial patriotism. So those are the ideal types and their ideal typical clash. But Ron doesn't stop there. With his commitment to looking beyond the models to the empirical material on the ground, Ron notes the contradictions and complications to these ideal models that show up when you look at history. And that's where his and our further work on empire moved. Rather than settling comfortably into the finding that empire strangled nation or that nation undermined empire, which I think we agree didn't really, in Russia, Ron pushes forward to investigate that relationship, not just in a binary way, maybe not just in a dialectical way as a push-pull, but as a much richer picture and as a productive analytical framework. And that's what we wanted to pursue in our book, where we took the notion of empire as the central focus for an interpretive analysis, not just a thing, a state to be described, but as a question. Where can and when can we identify imperial features in Russian history, and where and when do we see full-fledged empire? Beyond that, what does the imperial heuristic allow us to see that we might otherwise miss? Doing this required that we set aside the kind of moral framework in which, in the 20th century at least, empire had taken a distinctly negative flavor, that to describe something as imperial was immediately to condemn it. So we had to set that aside and think about, okay, if empire is a valuable interrogatory tool, what does it show us? Okay, so given Russia's long imperial experience, he found certain paths or choices would become more or less likely and more or less possible. So, for instance, confronted with the rise of nationalism and popular sovereignty, the famously reactionary Nicholas I responds not by digging into rigid stasis, but by forging a peculiarly conservative imperial vision. Moved by currents of egalitarianism and enfranchisement in the mid-19th century, Alexander II, the liberator of the serfs, responds by creating equalizing and enfranchising institutions and applying them unequally and differentially in imperial ways. Everyone gets voting rights, mostly, but they take different forms for different groups. Everyone gets access to new courts, but peasants get their own courts. The idea of homogeneity, horizontal equality, is just a non-starter in the Russian imperial concept. Zemstvas, institutions of provincial self-governance, are created, but only in Russian territories. So there's this default to imperial positions that are kind of prefigured by Russia's long history as an empire. They default to imperial modes of government, displaying what Ron's political science colleagues call path dependency, and we call history. This lens also lets us revisit this very fraught topic of Russification, which came up earlier. I think Ron mentioned it. This is one of those accusations that's leveled against the Russian Empire, that they conducted campaigns of Russification to make everyone identical and Russian. No, they Russified for sure in imperial ways. So they pushed Russian language and crushed local languages where and when it made sense within an imperial framework and for particular classes, categories, groups of people. It was never an across-the-board policy, never equally applied. It was a tool of empire. In perhaps the most controversial step, Ron has experimented with applying the imperial rubric to the Soviet Union. And he's taken a lot of flack for that. As I said, the term empire had a lot of negative connotation throughout the 20th century, and in the context of the Cold War, it was very clear that anyone who called the Soviet Union an empire was expressing a position on the Cold War binary, that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. But Ron, quite bravely, I think, decided to test the applicability of that concept even in the Soviet Union. There he found not an empire, but a pseudo-federalist state with an imperial tinge, with imperial aspects, where rule through difference and imbalance between the center and peripheries remained in play, where a spoke and wheel model of bilateral communication between center and periphery continued to dominate, but where a vociferous anti-imperial platform vied with those imperial tendencies. The Soviets expressed and in many ways acted on a commitment to radical egalitarianism, and a new form of Soviet nation started to take shape, complicating any straightforward application of the term empire. I don't see Anna, but Oh, there you are. Her work on this is particularly enlightening. So how does a consideration of imperial practices help us in Ukraine today? Ron's already given us some of his thoughts. We've already talked a little about affective dispositions. I'm not sure how helpful the framework would be, but it seems one that's worth considering. We certainly hear people tossing around very confident statements about what Putin is trying to accomplish, that he wants to restore the Soviet Union. Condoleezza Rice said that on NPR just yesterday, I think. Others, like John LeDunn, tell us with equally great confidence that Russia wants and needs to expand again to its natural boundaries, whatever those are. And we also hear that Putin wants to reconstitute the pre-revolutionary Russian Empire. Well, what would an imperial model give us for that? First, it would suggest a piecemeal and ad hoc approach to territorial acquisition. And that might say that we can confine our worry to Ukraine, which is plenty, but not extend it to specters of world domination, at least until proven otherwise. Another aspect of imperial behavior that seems relevant to me, and I think to Ron as well, although I'm speaking for him without consulting, is the tendency of empires to spill over across their formal boundaries and to send tentacles into other territories and populations, especially those of other empires. So, for instance, in the imperial period, Russia asserted itself as protector of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman lands, which led to no end of trouble, right? First we get the Crimean War, then we get World War I, partly a result of this extraterritorial ambition of the Russian Empire. Putin, I think, has honed that role with his claim to protect Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which seems to be Russians wherever they are, and people who are defined as Russians wherever they are. Yeah. So there's that. The imperial model also reminds us that the first stages of imperial acquisition are not pretty. They involve warfare, carnage, bloodshed, violence. If this is an imperial moment, it's not the one where difference is accepted and preserved or even celebrated as testimony to the awesome might of the sovereign. No, it's the stage where powerful armies of one state invade and smash the armies, peoples, and territories of another weaker state or people. Empire's star has risen in the past few decades as the term has shifted, at least in academia, from one of opprobrium to one really of appreciation of the kinds of diversity, the kinds of separate deals, the kinds of flexibility and capaciousness that empires can foster. And there is that, and I think we explore a lot of that in this book. That is the kind of empire, though, that is celebrated now by Vladimir Medinsky, the former Minister of Culture under Stalin, Putin's appointed negotiator in recent negotiations with Ukraine, recipient of 2 higher degrees in history on the basis of plagiarized work. Medinsky tells us that the Russian Empire was always about inclusion, voluntary union, and love of Russia. This isn't that kind of imperial move. Thank you.
Hi. So I have the job of talking about Ron's thinking about empire right after Val, who literally wrote a book on Ron's thinking of empire with Ron, which kind of makes me feel a little bit like that ventriloquist who followed the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show back in 1963. But I'll begin with talking a little bit about how I came to know Ron, or really more precisely how I came to know Ron's work. And that story is actually very similar to the story that Don Rowley told. I was a first year, even first semester student at Georgetown in Richard Steitz's Soviet history seminar. And Richard would give every student, assign every student one book to read for the week, not a common reading. We would each get a different book, and then we would have the job of the next week reporting on that book to the rest of the group and writing up a little report on that book. And I was assigned the Baku Commune on one of those very first weeks. And I actually, in preparation for this, went back and, went into my crawl space through the cobwebs to kind of pull out my notes on it. And I see, in retrospect, and I even saw at the time, how influential it was to me, making me recognize the importance of nationality in the story of the Soviet Union. When I entered Georgetown, I was planning on doing a dissertation on Soviet utopian thinking and on science fiction, the writing of science fiction. And it's a few books that I read, but certainly yours was one of those that really redirected me towards thinking about nationality and the role of nationalism, the national minorities, and the periphery, and particularly about the Jews is where I ended up going. Anyway, I reported on the book and came back with my report, and as Richard would do, after we each talked about the book, he would kind of say something about the author of the book. Tell us a little bit about them. Not like a gossipy thing or anything, but just a way of humanizing the authors for us, first-year graduate students, to make us recognize that the people writing these are actually human beings as well. And I remember what he said about Ron. He said, Ron is the nicest guy in the field and has a great sense of humor. And I thought that's really interesting, and that stuck with me, that little phrase. And then a few years later, I met Ron for the first time, and it was at one of those Midwest Russian history workshops. And I was just a graduate student. Well, I wasn't even presenting at it. I was just kind of going to observe. And I was a nothing at the time. Not that graduate students are nothing, but I felt like a nothing at the time. And I was introduced to Ron, and he very nicely shook my hand and said hello. I thought to myself, nice enough. And then later I saw him with another group of people at dinner, and they were all laughing, and I thought, oh, there's that sense of humor that we hear about. But in reality, never at that time did I imagine that, 15, 20 years later, I would actually end up as a colleague of Ron's. And now, having gotten to know him a little bit better, I really do see what Richard meant about him being one of the nicest people in the field. There's two other very nice people in the field that I'm able to work with as well. But really, and I see it in the workshops that he leads, and it's his ability to get to the crux of the argument when somebody is presenting and to critique it in the most generous way, to always give the benefit of the doubt to those who are presenting, to exalt in the success of others, which I see him do on a regular basis, and to bring out the best in everybody by remembering the common humanity that everybody has, which I think Val actually put very well in the let us eat cake idea, that whatever differences we have, we're all together. And I think there's a generosity of spirit in the way that you run the workshop and the way that you run your classes that I've seen that lead me to believe Richard was onto something. And the sense of humor too you have. So anyway, back to my reading of the Baku Commune, which really, as I said, had a tremendous influence on me in how I was to study Russian history, both in terms of nationality, but also just in terms of the general trajectory of Soviet history. Because at the time, this was my first year of graduate studies at Georgetown, as I said, and previously I had studied Russian history as an undergraduate at McGill University, where I studied with Valentin Boss, who was very much taught Russian history in the style of Richard Pipes, teaching about the revolution as a revolution of a close, tight-knit group of people. And going back to my notes, which, as I mentioned, I did going through the crawl space, I saw that I had underlined and really circled, one sentence, actually the same sentence that Don referred to from the back, but this is from the conclusion of the book, which says the picture of a highly disciplined conspiratorial party seizing power by force and then imposing its will on a reluctant population by terror bears little resemblance to what actually happened in Baku. And, you know, that seems so self-evident now. But at the time, at least to me it wasn't, and I think at the time you wrote it in 1972, and really at the time you wrote the dissertation in 68, that wasn't as self-evident as it was then. And to me, as a young green graduate student in 1993, that also wasn't all that self-evident. And that was one of my first realizations of the complexities of this field. So of course you were right about that. But it was really more the recognition that the Bolshevik Revolution was a multinational project supported by minority nations, and the realization that interethnic conflict between minorities in the periphery were a major part of the story that I think was more influential to me anyway. So much of the Soviet story you showed is about the ways in which class and nation are intertwined, and how we can think of the Soviet Union in terms of an imperial framework. You recognize this in 1972, seeing how different socioeconomic positions of Muslims, Georgians, and Armenians in Baku influenced how they interpreted and accepted Bolshevik rule and Soviet power. Already at a time when class formation and conflict were regarded as the major forces of history, you saw the significance of national differences and recognized the power of empire. And I think that has continued to influence your work as well as influenced the work of all of those of us who work in the field. Since 1991, it's become axiomatic to recognize the nationalities issue as the one that led to the breakup of the Soviet Union, or that led to the collapse, however one wants to call it, that led to the Soviet Union no longer being the Soviet Union. But Ron saw that earlier. And I just want to quote from an article that you wrote in the summer of 1989 in World Policy Journal. You said, the displacement of Marxism by patriotism and nationalism represents an important defeat for the Communist Party and a victory for the nationalist opposition. And I read that again recently, thinking that was in the summer of 1989, so that was even before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and 2 years before whatever happened to the Soviet Union, before the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The article, though, not only helps us understand what happened to the Soviet Union 2 months later and then 2 years later from 1989, but also what's happening right now 33 years later, really last week. And I'll return to that in a minute. But that article is relevant to today's conflict as much as it was relevant to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Also relevant to today's situation is another quote from that same article, from that same 1989 article, where you write, Russians in the non-Russian republics also complained of discrimination, arguing that affirmative action policies favoring the dominant nationality in each republic had degenerated into cronyism and nepotism. A backlash could be felt more generally among great Russians who grumbled that they alone of the Soviet peoples were not free to express their national aspirations and were the victims of the darker peoples of Central Asia and Caucasia. And I think you very well could have added Ukraine. And I'll note that, of course, this, the current conflict in Ukraine follows conflicts in Chechnya in 1996 and 1999 and in Georgia in 2008, also regions that you'd mentioned in that article back from the summer of 1989. So you're not only a very effective historian, but you're also a good futurologist, or at least were in 1989. We'll see how good you are right now at that in the future. But in this piece, and actually, so I'll now turn a little bit to the piece that I'm supposed to be commenting on, which is on The Empire Strikes Back, which I think comes out of a lot of the work on nationalism, and they're certainly related, empires and nations are certainly related in important ways. In that piece, you make the point that states are only considered empires when they fail to consolidate the ethnically heterogeneous groups that populate it. A state that's successful in incorporating peripheries and ethnically distinct populations into a single relatively homogeneous polity is celebrated as a nation state. By contrast, a state that maintains cultural distinctions, indigenous languages, and cultural diversity, a state, in other words, that does not force homogeneity upon the peoples under its rule, is considered to be an empire and ascribe negative attributes. Nation states are good, empires are bad, and empires are really, evil, to use Reagan's terminology. Empire, though, Ron shows, was also used to describe states that were considered internally repressive and externally expansionist. He points out in this essay that the Soviet Union was not considered to be an empire until it failed. And when it failed, it was deemed an empire because it failed. The breakup of the Soviet Union led many to declare that the minority peoples had never fully integrated, had retained their distinct identities, and continued to regard the sovereignty of the center as a foreign occupying power. In other words, the pundits declared the Soviet Union had been an empire after all. In his brilliant analysis of the issue, Ron points to many of the anomalies of the Russian and Soviet case. For one, of course, it was a contiguous empire rather than an overseas empire. And this creates messiness, as history tends to do. For one, many conventional empires were able to liberalize and democratize the metropole while maintaining harsh and repressive regimes in the colonies. This is much more difficult to sustain in a contiguous empire where liberalism and democracy can easily spread and destabilize the empire. Two, migration across the empire tends to create both a highly integrated economy and a mobile population. Over time, these factors can have the effect of creating shared historical experiences and cultural features. In other words, normally over time, contiguous empires, or at least in a normative model, contiguous empires would turn into nation states. But precisely because the Soviet Union did not see itself as a nation state, the Soviet Union failed to follow this path. It saw itself as something beyond a nation state, as something encompassing all types of different peoples, and so was never directed towards the idea of establishing a nation state. And that's why it can be seen as something else, as some type of multinational state, or ultimately, once it collapses, as an empire. But it also failed to act like an empire. At least initially, it failed to act as an empire. Its ruling class, for instance, was drawn overwhelmingly from the minorities: Latvians, Jews, Poles, Georgians, and Armenians. And that's not what empires are supposed to do. The very legitimacy of the Soviet state, in fact, depended upon its success in incorporating these ethnic minorities and in making these ethnic minorities feel like they have a stake in the state. But it was a stake in becoming Bolsheviks, not becoming Russians. And I think we really see this in the early period of the Bolshevik state, looking at foreign affairs and the way foreigners are talking about it. I was looking particularly recently, well, for the book that I recently wrote, about the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk. And I see that foreigners are calling them Bolsheviks, not Russians, making that distinction. And over time, that seems to change. They stop referring, foreign countries, foreign diplomats stop referring to the ruling class in the Soviet Union as Bolsheviks and start referring to them as Russians. And that's probably the point at which the Soviet Union starts to become more of an empire rather than whatever kind of entity it was previously. Now, the problem, of course, is that empires and states are fluid. Groups emerge into nationhood out of larger entities on a regular basis and sometimes manage to attain sovereignty through formal separation. At the same time, smaller entities routinely merge together to form United Nations. As we can see in the case of the Soviet Union, these processes continually took place, shifting and turning really by the decade. Nationalism was still largely an urban elite phenomenon in 1917 and was only strengthened in the 1920s through the promotion of nativization policies, as Ron shows in this article. It's for that reason that Putin today can say that Lenin created Ukrainians because of that nativization policy. And the nativization policy facilitated a flourishing of national identity, which, when Stalin started imprisoning and executing national elites in the 1930s, deporting nations en masse from their homelands, and undermining religion and local cultures, at that point, Moscow started to be seen more as an alien and coercive power. And it's at this point, one could argue, that the Soviet Union becomes an empire. So I would say it's not the 1920s, it's not the nativization policies, it's not the allowing national minorities to express themselves in their own languages that gives birth to national consciousness that in turn creates the idea that the Soviet Union was an empire. But it's actually the crushing of those. It's the idea that they are discriminated against because, as Ron has said many times, every nation needs a genocide as its foundational myth. And it's that genocidal myth, it's the idea of being repressed in the 1930s after they're created that really cements the idea of nationhood. After World War II, this process increases as Russia becomes more centered, or as the Soviet Union, I should say, that's a Freudian slip, becomes more centered on Russia, and as Russian identity becomes a more integral component of the Soviet Union. And actually, I see this in the example of Jews in the Soviet Union that I've studied the most of, particularly in 1951, 1952, after the establishment of the State of Israel. There's a movement of Jews who want to migrate to the State of Israel. And they argue that they should be allowed to do so under the principle of the reunification of families. And Jews start writing the Soviet central authorities asking to migrate to Israel. And Soviet officials say, quote, "The emigration of Soviet people to a country with different social conditions would contradict the basic principles of the Soviet state." In other words, if they allow people of the national minorities to emigrate to another country, then everybody will. And eventually they start to say that if we allow the Jews to emigrate, then everybody's going to want to leave. Then the Poles will want to leave, and the Uzbeks will want to leave, and the Ukrainians will want to leave. And in many ways, fast forward to the 1980s and 1990s, and that's what happens when the Soviet Union starts to allow Jews to migrate to Israel in the 1980s and starts to allow the people who had been refused visas for many years, the refuseniks, to migrate to the State of Israel, is when this is when the idea collapses, the idea that nobody would want to leave collapses. And by the 1980s, just as a show of the how the multinational legitimacy of what is now the Soviet Empire was crumbling, and Ron points this out in the article as well, I think it's telling that 50 of the 55 ministers in Gorbachev's government were of Russian ethnicity. And that's a radical change from the early Soviet Union that truly was a multinational government ruling a multinational state. So by this time, although Gorbachev spoke of a return to a multinational state where the states would get some type of cultural or economic autonomy, the trust had been lost, and the nationalities would only at this point accept full sovereignty. It's no wonder then that by 1991, the former Soviet republics had by and large decided that they were being held captive in a prison of nations and sought to break free, including the metropole itself, when Yeltsin separates Russia from the Soviet Union. Again, getting back to the point you made in that 1989 article, that the Russians themselves feel that they are being oppressed. But the modern version of the Spring of Nations was restricted to the republic-level nations, and conflict followed when those who were not titular republics also attempted to separate and to declare their own sovereignty and self-dependence. The rest of the essay that I read, the Empire Strikes Back essay, is really a tour de force of pre-revolutionary Russian history through the prism of empire. And I thought maybe I could run through that. I'll point out a few things in it. One, I think the central premise, at least as I see it, is that Russia, as an empire before the revolution, never fully developed a national identity, and instead developed an identity focused on orthodoxy in the state. The state was seen as the principal agent of progress rather than the people. So when the empire was expanding, it absorbed some elites, while others were able to retain separate privileges and identities. As you write, quote, nationalizing, homogenizing policies, integrating disparate peoples into a common Russian community coexisted with policies of discrimination and distinction. And again, quote, there was no thickening web of economic, legal, and cultural links on the scale of, say, those in early modern France. The peasants failed, and I think you use this example, the peasants failed to become Russians as they became French people in France. I was reading your extended essay a few weeks ago actually, and just yesterday, And now I'm kind of deviating a little bit from my prepared remarks, but just yesterday I was reading Putin's July 2021 history of Russia, and kind of thinking of those two in conjunction with each other, because they're really mirror images of each other. If Putin had read Suny, I don't think we would be in the mess that we're in today, to put it bluntly. We'd be, so just to give you, I want to quote a little bit from Putin's writing about Putin's version of the history of Russia, and just to show how it's a failure to imagine the dynamism of Russia, the dynamism of human beings in Putin's view, which is a very static view of nations and static view of empire. Putin says, quote, and now I would like to discuss, he says, he portrays Russia and Ukraine as, quote, essentially the same historical and spiritual space, and writes, attempts to play on the national question and sow discord among people had the overarching goal of dividing and pitting the parts of a single people against one another. Later, Putin writes, the rights for the republics to freely secede from the Union was included in the text of the Declaration of the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and subsequently in the 1924 USSR Constitution. By doing so, the authors planted in the foundation of our statehood the most dangerous time bomb. And again, Putin writes, and the most despicable thing is that the Russians in Ukraine are being forced not only to deny their roots, generations of their ancestors, but also to believe that Russia is their enemy. And here we have exactly what you were predicting in that 1989 essay. And again, it is the mirror image of the way that societies really work, and the way that nations really work, and the way that empires really work. The fluidity and dynamism of humanity is completely removed from Putin's writing, and is really what powers Ron's writings. Human beings, I think Ron shows, are complex, messy people. They don't always follow historical laws, but rather sometimes latch on to other ideas like nationalism, or even vegetarianism, one could say, that throw wrenches into the historical process laid out for them to follow. One needs flexibility in writing about history. And I think you've always shown this in all of your writings. Show the flexibility in the way things don't follow laws that are laid out for them in advance. You have a recognition and appreciation for the quirkiness of human beings, and that they don't always follow these ironclad laws. I think in many ways, and I'll conclude on this, the recognition of the humanity in the historical studies, in the historical subjects that you study, even recognizing the humanity in somebody like Stalin, as well as in the people that you interact with on a daily basis, recognizing that humanity, recognizing the flexibility, and recognizing that everybody that people are messy and people are human, is really your most important contribution to the field. And I think that Richard Stites was right. You are a nice guy.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Val. Ron, do you want to come up and join us? We don't have as long. Melanie, how long do we want to go until?
We can go 4:15, 4:20.
4:15, 4:20. So we've got about 15 minutes. I'll just pose a simple question to start off with, and then open it up to the floor. The panel is called The Empire Strikes Back, and we talked a lot about empires and imperial heuristics. I'm wondering if we could sort of ask you all to think about the other side, the colony. What if it's the colony strikes back, where there's imperial writings about the place of the colony for the empire, you know? And I was thinking about this in terms, we talked about the Baku Commune throughout the day. If you were to be rewriting the Baku Commune now, from this perspective, how, if at all, would the imperial turn or this imperial approach reshape the framing of that work?
Wow. Yeah, I was young then, you know, and now I don't even remember what I had for breakfast. And I eat the same thing every morning. I'll tell you something. Every book I wrote, not every book, but I learned a different language, right? So I didn't speak native Armenian at home. I learned Armenian. I learned Russian, of course. I learned Turkish. I tried to learn Turkish. My son-in-law is helping me learn Turkish, and so forth. I didn't learn Azerbaijani. And I think I had a kind of Russo-centric and Armeno-centric, because the Armenians were the bourgeoisie of Baku. And over again in that book, they refer to the Azerbaijanis, or then there was no word Azerbaijani, then they were called Muslims or Tatari. And they refer to them repeatedly as Chomnia, as dark, as uneducated, as unconscious, nisaznatilny. They didn't have political consciousness. So there was, from the Russian literature, there was a colonial vision, and you didn't hear the voices back. That Krista and others have done since that. And I even got to the absurd thing one time. I had sent the book to Princeton, and as I'm reading the last draft, I saw this word, nisaznatilny, and I translated it unconscious, right? It meant politically unconscious. And so I had a paragraph in which said, a crowd of unconscious Muslims launched an attack on the city hall. And you could just see them, like, so, because so Doug, it's not that you're accusing me, but I was a victim of that precise thing. Now, Azerbaijan is in some ways, or was for a long time, a Chomnaya Nazi, a dark nation, because no one was working on it. And the people who did work, and I won't mention any names, became too nationalistic. And now archives are closed, as Krista said, and so forth. But I did read a dissertation recently. There is no one else to send dissertations to on the rise of the Azerbaijani or Muslim intelligentsia. And they're beginning to see that, yeah, there were people who were thinking this way. Not ordinary people. Again, Azerbaijan is a nation that was absolutely made in the Soviet period, more than any other. There was no coherent Azerbaijani identity before, except among a few intellectuals. And even they wanted to stay within the Russian Empire. So now maybe a little bit of that history is coming out. But it's hard to do it from the periphery in when we don't have that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. I see Brian in the back.
So a question about empire. When Reagan used that horrible term of the evil empire, I think he was, if memory serves, I think he was talking about not just the Soviet Union and the many nationalities within the Soviet Union, but the broader sphere of Soviet influence. The idea that the Soviets were colonizing, as Doug just put it. And so all the nations of the Warsaw Pact, nations in Latin America and Africa and Asia, where the Soviet influence was building, this idea that was an imperial move. And I've always been interested, is there any utility, not, in the sense Reagan used it, obviously none whatsoever, but is there any utility in thinking about the Soviet Union as a source of colonial-like initiatives? I mean, we can see a civilizing mission of a sort, right? Spreading of socialism. On the other hand, in most cases, the periphery, the colonies, quote unquote, were actually wealthier than the metropole, which makes it a really, really weird empire. And insofar as there were any wealth transfers, it went the other way. So I don't know. Just I'd be interested to hear any of your ruminations on how the Soviet sphere broadly was, in any sense, imperial.
I think it was imperial, particularly at certain times. So you had, I would frankly say, and I loved both reports on the book. They showed things that I had already forgotten or we didn't see well enough. There was a phrase by Val that was so extraordinary, but I'll find it at some point in what the book was about. So there was an internal empire. I guess our argument was the Soviet Union became a kind of empire in the form of a pseudo-federal state. And that pseudo-federal state had these, as Val put it, these definite imperial features. And the interest, and then there would be an external empire, particularly under Stalin. So let's say roughly 1947 or 48 till the end of Stalinism and into almost 1956. And then, as Khrushchev drew back after the Hungarian Revolution, you get a different thing, a different formation. And I think we often blend the terms hegemony and empire together. So I would not say the Americans have an empire globally or in Latin America. I would say they are a hegemon, which means they don't dominate the domestic and foreign policy of those countries, but they make sure that those countries in their external relations particularly, but maybe also being democratic in capitalism is far more important to us than democracy, are operating in the right way. And as the Soviets drew back after the Stalin period, because they weren't so willing, except occasionally, 53 in Germany, 56 in Hungary, 68 in Czechoslovakia, they had to give more. And they had to allow a variety of things that Brzezinski, in one of his best books, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Soviet bloc, said is polycentrism. They called it polycentrism, a term that I guess we don't use anymore. And there were a variety of different ways they ruled. Poland, after several resistances, you know very well, was allowed to decollectivize and to form other things. Romania almost left the bloc. So there was something else, I would call it hegemony. No one seriously threatened the Soviet Union, and so they could be tolerated, until Dubček in 1968, at least in the reading of Brezhnev, and so they sent the invasion. Somebody said, I guess it was Jeff, that I'm a very good futurologist. I'm someone who predicted that Brezhnev wouldn't invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. I predicted on PBS that the Soviet Union would not collapse. I would have predicted, but luckily I held my breath and said Putin would not invade Ukraine in 2022 because it's an insane idea to do, and it will lead to disaster for Ukraine, for Russia, for the world. And he's a rationalist. He's a realpolitik type, and I have no way to describe what was going on and why he took that move. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question from Anush, and then there's a question from Scott afterwards.
Thank you all so much. This has been a fascinating panel. So along the line of empires striking out, I want to follow Val's lead in an earlier panel to ask about a comparative empire. I was thinking about these accusations that Putin wants to restore the USSR or expand territory to its natural boundaries. And I'm reminded of another neighboring state that also was a former empire, now a nation state, and also wants to become, or perhaps is, a regional hegemon, and also in which the official discourse is characterized often by an imperial nostalgia, and that is Turkey. So I'd love to hear any of your thoughts about what we can learn about or think about contemporary Turkey, post-Ottoman Empire, from this discussion of the Russian Empire. Thank you.
So before I answer Anush's question, which was such a good question, Anush. She's my daughter. Anyway, and so I found that statement that Val said, and I don't think we said this as clearly in the book as we should have, and that is they Russified in imperial ways, differentially, over in different spaces, and it's true. We know Paul Worth's work in the Volga region, and we know what Alexander III did. They never followed through. They didn't try it in other places. That's a beautiful one. It'll be in the next edition. And also, before I answer Anush's question, I want to say Val was far too modest. Her contribution to the book was not simply rewriting the Empire States that strikes out. Val's contribution was she kept a certain Marxist from being too dogmatic, sometimes too clear. I came from political science from Chicago. And she would tell me things are more complicated. We have to complexify this. We have to nuance it. All of that was extraordinarily important. And so the book is really a dual book. Val did not, at first, as I remember, think we should really necessarily go back to Kiev and Rus and so forth. It wasn't an empire then. It was not even a state then. But I reread that chapter so that when I have to talk on somewhere, I could understand what really Kievan Rus was about. It's absolutely essential to the book because it tells us precisely what empire wasn't, and when when Muscovy occurred, and when the Mongols came, how then this other imperial kind of setting developed. So, Anush, the book argues, and I think this is a transferable and translatable concept, if I'm understanding your question, that empire or any very useful historical concept, revolution, nation, empire, whatever, should not be simply descriptive. It shouldn't say, these are the characteristics of. When Val listed those characteristics, there's an implied interpretive and even explanatory generative element to it. So we don't simply describe empire, we say, if a state is built inequitably, differentially, with some people having the right to rule over others precisely because they're different and superior, then it's very difficult for that ruling group to evolve or develop itself into an egalitarian, homogeneous polity that we could call a nation. And as Val pointed out in her short history today, time and again, the Russian Empire would do something that looks homogenizing or that looks like it's nationalizing, and yet it was held back because the aristocracy and others had to be different and it's superior in order to have the right to rule over this diverse group of people. So those states that choose to be imperial, this will be interesting to follow if Russia in fact becomes the imperial occupier of Ukraine, you know, and then it cannot effectively integrate because it's the big brother over the little brother, the Velikiye Ruskiye over the Maliye Ruskiye, that will prevent it ever from becoming Yedini Narod, one people, or Ruski Mir, right? You can't both very easily be imperial and nationalizing at the same time, though Russians tried that repeatedly. Turkey today is an empire. It's a nationalizing empire. It's trying to be a nation state, but it can't swallow its own non-Turkish peoples. I don't want to say minorities, because Kurds are not a minority in Kurdistan. They're the overwhelming majority, and they can't swallow it. And they are failing to swallow it, and that is precisely why it also prevents them from becoming democratic. So where's the Kurdish leaders of the HDP, of the Kurdish National Party? They're in jail. They're in jail. No one seems to even notice in the West that much, you know. Friends of ours, people we know. So yeah, I would say it's imperial. Is that what you wanted to ask about? Yeah.
Melanie's not looking at me, so I'm not sure if I have permission to, we have two questions that have
Yeah,
been-
sorry.
Are we okay?
Scott is
Scott and
next,
Don.
and then I'm pass the
I
mic to
think
Don.
Don had the last word.
Did you want to say something?
No, just.
Well, it was I liked Anusha's question because I was also thinking about this comparative empires project that we had some time ago in your absence that had to do with comparing the Ottoman, the Habsburg, and the Russian empires, the continental empires, which goes back to Jeff's description of your description of the situation as being different from overseas empires, in some ways self-destructing for particular structural reasons. My question had to do with the sort of structural reason of the Empire Strikes Back as reported by Jeff and as remembered by me from a long time ago. When I read it, I'm really impressed by all of this. Of course, I'm completely on board with, you know, complexifying. I usually use the archaic term complicating, but also, or nuancing in these ways that, you know, I think both of these presentations really pointed up. But it does, you know, I wonder about the agency given to empire in the examples given. And I'm also, you know, for me, the success or failure of the ideology of empire or of nationalism, you know, is always connected to, you know, problem of subjectivity and of the particular ways in which actual subjects identify or disidentify, resist, or, or even more interestingly, unconsciously, in a way, are on board with elements of ideology. And so that's what I always, am thinking about throughout the presentations, is just the different layers that can exist simultaneously. Because, I mean, I think in the place where I spend most of my time, I see many places where there can be simultaneous, ideological saturation with national identities and imperial identities, and then in identities that aren't named imperial but that are compatible with it. And that much more complicated picture is what I see. It's not complicated, for all subjects. I mean, there are subjects who literally resist, but that's not always, what's going on. So I kind of just wonder, I mean, is it a little top-down to think of empires as agents in the ways that, we keep articulating here? And do you have to think about subjectivities and ideology in a different way? The ideology active in this, milieu was internationalism, and that does, color things differently from, ordinary empires. So that was my question.
I think, can we have Don ask as one last question, so we ask both, and then you can speak together?
Thanks for a very lively conversation this afternoon. My question is, I see the Soviet Union as an ideological state, and a state that sought to create a new identity. We talked earlier about identities. Was it a failure to create a Soviet identity, a Homo Sovieticus, that led to the results in 1991? And I was also struck, all the panelists mentioned, from Val, from Putin's comments about Russian world, and Ron and Jeff too, about the great Russian, right, quotes, feeling left out in this empire to a certain extent. This was really pronounced in the 1970s when Brezhnev was in power. And the Russian Party it was called a Russian Party within the Communist Party and among Russian cultural elites, that this approach we have to statehood is leaving out the Russians themselves. And of course, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, this doesn't go away, and I would think that the quote-unquote introduction of democracy and capitalism in the 1990s only is going to exacerbate these feelings. And I wonder if there's a direct line there to what Putin's doing to a certain extent. Thanks.
Okay, if we could have a brief response from those who feel so moved. Jeff, Val? No? No? Pass? On to Ron?
These are hard questions. These are very hard questions, but they're big questions and important ones. First, to Scott, I would say, I think structures matter. When I was a certain kind of Marxist, would that vulgar Marxism worked, right? If it were so easy, right? It doesn't work, but that the base really determines the superstructure. It was just so nice at that time. Anyway, that doesn't work. But structures still matter, right? We talk about agency and subjectivity, of course. And within structures, there's all kinds of, men make their own history, but not the way they choose, etc. So I think, insofar as a state is ruled by a superior group, like the British in India, let's say, or whatever, and wants to maintain that superiority in order to legitimately rule with some degree of hegemony rather than simple coercion, then it's restrained in certain ways. And it will, at certain points, use violence and so forth. And in our work and other places, it's the peripheries that get the violence. In 1905, the worst places to be were the Caucasus, the Baltic states, and Poland. That's where they used the most violence. So I think those structures really do matter, but we have to remember that they're individuals, and sometimes powerful individuals, like autocrats, who also can make significant changes within those structures. And that's one of the principal problems of historians, is how much weight do we give to one and to the other, right? And we always are negotiating that. Don's question, if I remember them now, I think the question was the failure of creating Homo Sovieticus, or Soviet identity are the reason. And Anna should actually answer this question. Anna, this wonderful student of ours who's now about to go to her first big job, is writing about Sovietsky Narod, which was precisely this attempt. And in general, before recent work and Anna's work, that was considered some kind of ideological, as someone said, tepid thing, like official nationality. And it didn't work. Well, it turns out in many ways it did work. That is, there were centrifugal forces that we will all emphasize that eventually led to Soviet disintegration. And what we underestimated was the centripetal forces that were holding it together. In March of 1991, 76.8% of the population in the republics that voted to keep the Soviet Union. Wasn't clear in what form, but of sovereign equal republics, etc. And had something like that worked, had Yeltsin and others not destroyed the Soviet Union in their drunken stupor as they did in December of 1991, maybe Gorbachev's plan to change an empire into a multinational federation might have worked. And we might have had something more like, and this is utopian perhaps in retrospect, the European Union, or something looser, confederation of some kind. We'll never be able to run that again. The same republic, let's say Ukraine, that voted 70+% to stay in the Soviet Union in March, voted 90% in December after the coup and after these events to leave the Soviet Union. So contingency and events are very important in that story. And luckily, as Jeff said in one of our seminars so beautifully, he said, and I'm quoting Jeff over and over again, historians, chronology is your friend. It may be one damn thing after another, as Henry Ford said, or no, he said history is bunk. Or it might be path dependency, as Val pointed out, which is just history in economics and political science. But it's important what came first and how things changed over time. And so there was another question, but I'm not sure I remember it any longer. So we'll talk about that at dinner.
And that's okay, because we're out of time anyway. So let's draw it to a close there and thank the panelists for a great talk.